The flames rise faster than the screams. Smoke coils through narrow streets as arrows rain down like a storm that will not end. Doors splinter beneath the weight of axes. Mothers clutch children only to have them torn away by riders who move with brutal certainty. Men are seized and bound with ropes that bite deep into the skin, driven into lines with blows and shouts. Every sound is swallowed by the roar of fire and the pounding of hooves. Women are dragged by their hair into alleys, where the shadows hide what will come next. The air is thick with terror, the taste of ash mixed with the salt of sweat and blood. In the chaos, there is no sense of who will be killed and who will be kept. Some fall where they stand, cut down in the smoke. Others are spared, though spared is not the right word. To survive the assault is to begin a new ordeal, one stripped of dignity, freedom, and even hope. For the Mongols, captives were not people but spoils, tools, and warnings. And for those who were bound instead of slain, one question haunted every step into the night: what fate awaited the living? Before diving into these forgotten stories of institutional cruelty, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. When the gates finally collapse, it is not a roar of triumph, but the beginning of silence. The defenders who shouted from the walls are gone, their cries drowned by the rhythm of hooves striking stone. The Mongols pour in with such speed that the city seems to break all at once. There is no battle line, no orderly defense. Streets that once echoed with market stalls and children's voices become rivers of smoke and confusion. The invaders cut through anything that moves, not with frenzy, but with ruthless calculation. This is the true heart of their power. The terror is not an accident of war. It is a weapon sharpened as carefully as any blade. Families bolt their doors but find them smashed open in moments. Men reach for tools to defend their homes and are struck down before they can lift their arms. Women clutch their children and stumble into alleys, only to be surrounded and driven back into the streets. The Mongols kill when it serves them, and when it does not, they spare. That decision comes quickly, without warning. A rider points, and a family is cut down. Another rider points, and a group is bound with ropes and pushed forward. The chaos is not random. It is order imposed by fear. Soon the city fills with the sound of corralling. Survivors are herded into squares and courtyards, their belongings stripped away, their faces streaked with ash. Ropes loop around wrists, necks, and waists, pulling strangers into unwilling chains. Mothers are tied to men they have never seen. Children are tethered to elders who stumble beneath the weight of exhaustion. From above, it must have looked like the sorting of herds, but on the ground it feels worse than slaughter, because slaughter at least brings an end. Among the captives, a select few are noticed. A smith with broad arms is pulled aside. A man known for carving stone is separated from the crowd. A woman who knows dyes and weaving is dragged away to a different corner. A scribe with the ability to read 2 languages is pushed out of line and placed near an officer. These are not spared out of kindness, but chosen as property of higher value. Their lives are bought by their skills, though what awaits them will not be comfort, but a different form of bondage. They are investments in the Empire's endless advance. The rest feel the ropes cut into their skin as the march begins. Driven through the very gates they once trusted to protect them, they stumble into the open countryside, past bodies and burning timbers, past wells fouled with blood. Behind them their city is collapsing, and ahead of them lies only uncertainty. Some hope that by surviving the first storm, they have escaped the worst, but the riders who guard them do not speak of mercy. They do not slow their pace for the old or the young. The first to stumble is struck down without hesitation, and the lesson spreads down the line without a word. As the fires shrink behind them, the truth settles into every captive's heart. Survival has not freed them, it has chained them. For the men, the chains meant labor and exhaustion. But for the women pulled from the crowd, the ordeal took another shape, one whispered about, yet rarely spoken aloud. Their survival was not spared strength, but stolen dignity. And as night fell on the first march, the women learned that their fates were not to be decided in the open square, but in the shadows where power took its cruelest form. The sorting of captives was not random. Among the bound and the broken, the women were always the first to be singled out. The riders moved through the lines with eyes that did not see people, only bodies. Faces were studied, not with compassion, but with calculation. Age, beauty, and health became the currency by which a woman's survival was measured. The silence of appraisal was heavier than the clash of steel, for in that silence, everyone understood what it meant. The women were not being spared. They were being claimed. The most beautiful, the daughters of nobles, and those of striking appearance were taken aside for the commanders. These women were set apart not because they would be protected, but because they were now possessions of the highest rank. They were paraded as spoils of victory, proof that the city had fallen completely. Some were forced into marriages, meant to cement loyalty or erase identity. Others were kept as concubines, their lives reduced to the whims of a man who had crushed their home. The rest were not overlooked. Soldiers who had charged through the flames now received their share. Women were divided among them as rewards, scattered like loot taken from a market stall. Chroniclers in Persia and China speak of entire groups of women parceled out in the aftermath of a battle, some disappearing into the camps of common soldiers, others vanishing altogether. Their names were rarely recorded, their fates never followed. What mattered to the empire was not who they had been, but that they were now absorbed into it, body and soul. For many, the ordeal began the moment they were dragged from their families. Husbands could do nothing but watch as their wives were pulled away. Mothers screamed as their children were torn from their arms. Fathers who tried to intervene were cut down where they stood, their bodies left behind while their daughters were carried off. In some cases, women were marched with the rest of the captives, but separated at night, their absence noted only in the silent tears of those who remained. The chronicles describe a pattern that was both intimate and systematic. Women became spoils not just in the private tents of warriors, but in the structure of the empire itself. Some were forced to bear children in households that had destroyed their own. Others were transported far from their homeland, their identities erased, their languages silenced. They were not simply captives, but instruments of conquest, used to break bloodlines, dissolve families, and ensure that the memory of resistance would not pass easily to the next generation. What made the experience most terrifying was its inevitability. A woman could not bargain her way free. Skill or strength meant little. Even noble birth, which sometimes spared men by granting them ransom, offered no guarantee. Beauty was not a blessing, but a curse. And yet the absence of beauty did not mean safety either. The Mongols did not waste what they considered useful, and usefulness came in many forms. Night after night, the reality settled in for those taken. Survival had meant stepping into another kind of death, one in which the body lived but the self was stripped away. The screams of women carried through the camps long after the fires of conquest died down, and for every captive who vanished into a commander's tent, others were left with soldiers whose treatment was no less cruel. While the women were claimed as prizes, the men soon discovered that their own fate would not be gentler. For them, strength was not a shield but a burden. It would be bent, exploited, and consumed until nothing remained. For the men who survived the slaughter, the meaning of survival was quickly revealed. Their strength, the very thing that had carried them through battle or flight, was the reason they were kept alive. The Mongols had no interest in their dignity, only in the labor their bodies could produce. Ropes that had bound them in the square were never loosened for mercy. They were tightened, adjusted, and knotted again so the captives could be marched out into the open country like beasts of burden. From the moment the march began, every man was given a purpose, though none were spared the humiliation of servitude. Some were forced to carry the baggage of the warriors, stumbling under loads of supplies that seemed to grow heavier with every mile. Others were tethered to herds of horses and livestock, their task to drive the animals forward across steppes that seemed endless. When the army approached a river, the captives were sent to drag timber, lash it into rafts, and wade waist-deep in freezing water until a crossing stood ready. When the land rose into rough hills, the same men were ordered to dig trenches or flatten the ground for encampments. The Mongols demanded speed, and speed meant the work never stopped. In sieges, the cruelty grew sharper still. Men were marched to the front not as fighters, but as shields. Stripped of weapons, they were driven toward the walls of enemy cities, forced to soak up arrows meant for their masters. Some carried ladders they would never climb. Others heaved stones or logs to the base of walls where they collapsed and were left to die. Siege engines were dragged into place, not by animals, but by lines of captives, their backs breaking beneath the weight of timber while the Mongols stood behind with whips and arrows ready to enforce obedience. Food was scarce by design. Warriors ate first, their horses second, and captives last if there was anything left. Hunger hollowed their faces, weakness bent their bodies, yet the demands never lessened. A man who faltered was not pitied but discarded. Sometimes his throat was cut so he would not slow the column. Other times he was left where he fell, his body trampled into the dust as the army pressed on. The message was clear. The empire did not need individuals, only what could be extracted from them before they broke. The despair deepened with every passing day. Men who once held positions of respect, merchants, scholars, guards, were reduced to silence, their hands blistered from endless hauling, their backs scarred from the lash. Even the strongest felt their strength consumed like firewood, one task after another leaving them weaker until only exhaustion remained. And yet, the Mongols extracted every ounce they could. A captive was useful until the moment he was not. At that moment, he ceased to exist in the eyes of his captors. Witnesses describe the blank stares of men forced to march with ropes cutting into their skin, their bodies bowed, their spirits emptied. They were alive, but only in the sense that their hearts still beat. Everything else that had once made them men, family, freedom, pride, was stripped away. If men were broken in this way, and women were violated until even survival felt like loss, what of the children who had no strength to give and no choice to make? Their fate was not spared by their youth. It was defined by it. For the smallest and weakest, there was no protection. Children, who might have been spared in other wars for their innocence or their potential ransom, often met their end at the edge of a blade. The Mongols measured value with ruthless precision, and those too young to work or fight were seen as burdens. Entire groups of children were cut down in courtyards or left in burning houses, their cries smothered by fire and smoke. For the Mongols, such killings were not cruelty for its own sake, but policy. A dead child would never grow into a resister, never grow into a fighter who could one day reclaim their home. Yet not all were killed. Some were seized and carried away, their fate chosen by the needs of the empire. Young boys were taken as servants, their days spent fetching water, tending fires, or grooming horses until they were old enough to shoulder heavier burdens. The strongest among them, once grown, could be forced into the ranks of the very armies that had destroyed their families. Others were absorbed into households as lowly attendants, their childhood erased by orders and blows. Girls suffered in ways equally brutal, though often hidden from the open square. Many were taken as concubines while still young, their bodies treated as extensions of conquest. Those not kept by warriors were trafficked further afield, sold into slave markets that stretched across Central Asia. From Samarkand to Bukhara, girls vanished into systems where they would never be seen again, their names forgotten as their identities dissolved into the commerce of flesh. For their families, the absence was a wound that never healed. Mothers who survived captivity wept not only for their stolen daughters, but for the silence that followed, a silence that stretched across years and across borders. The despair of separation defined these moments. Families were dismantled with calculated speed. A father might be executed before his children to make obedience sink deeper into the hearts of the survivors. A mother might be forced to watch as her child was carried off by strangers, knowing the chances of reunion were as thin as smoke rising from the ruins of their home. Even those few children who remained with their families were not spared suffering. The marches that followed the sack of a city showed no kindness to small legs or weary steps. When a child lagged behind, the riders did not slow. The line kept moving, and the weak were left to collapse in the dust. The elderly fared no better. Too frail to march, too slow to keep pace, they were often executed outright. Some were abandoned on the roadside, their bodies left as stark reminders of the price of weakness. In the eyes of the empire, an old man or woman who could not labor was already dead, their breath no more valuable than the smoke of the campfires. Through this system of ruthless selection, the Mongols reshaped entire populations. Youth, age, and family ties meant nothing in the face of empire. What mattered was usefulness, and usefulness was measured only in strength, obedience, or beauty. Everything else was cut away. And yet, even those who survived this first culling, men forced into labor, women taken as prizes, children and the elderly scattered or slain, did not find safety in their survival. Their lives were not their own. They had been absorbed into the great machine of conquest, a machine that would grind on for years without pause. For those drawn into it, the Mongol war machine was not a path to freedom. It was a prison with no escape. Life inside the Mongol camps was a second conquest, one that played out day after day in small humiliations and constant fear. The captives who survived the slaughter of their cities and the brutality of the marches were forced into the endless rhythm of service. From dawn until the fading of the fires at night, they labored for the empire that had crushed them. The air of the camp was filled with smoke from cooking fires, the stench of animals, and the sharp commands of warriors. It was here that captives learned they were no longer individuals, only tools to be used until they broke. Daily life meant ceaseless work. Some captives were tasked with tending the herds, walking for miles across the steppes as they drove sheep and horses from one pasture to another. Others rose before the sun to cook, preparing meals for warriors who would eat long before the slaves were allowed even scraps. Captives carried water, collected dung for fuel, and mended tents against the relentless winds. Men were forced to repair weapons they would never wield, their hands blistered from the sharpening of blades that might one day strike down more of their own people. Women who were not taken as concubines were ordered to weave, sew, and patch the garments of their masters, their every movement watched, their silence enforced. The atmosphere was one of constant threat. Captives were always disposable. A horse poorly fed, a garment sewn badly, a mistake in the preparation of a meal. Any small failure could be punished by death. A rider might cut down a servant for no reason at all, and no one would question it. The life of a slave held less weight than that of the animals they tended, for at least the horses were considered essential to the empire's advance. Captives lived with the knowledge that their breath continued only because it was briefly useful. A harsh hierarchy existed among the enslaved. Those with valuable skills, such as blacksmiths, masons, or scribes, were guarded more carefully. They were still captives, but their talents bought them a fragile shield of survival. They were often fed better, housed slightly more securely, and sometimes even given limited protection, for their masters wanted their work to continue. Yet this was not mercy. It was exploitation. Their lives were worth only as much as the labor they could provide. Once their skill was no longer needed, they joined the others in disposability. Among the countless who perished unseen, a rare few managed to rise. Chronicles speak of artisans who impressed their captors enough to be placed in the service of khans, or scribes who became indispensable translators in dealings with foreign powers. These exceptions were celebrated later as proof that the Mongols valued talent above origin. But the truth lay in the silence of the many who never escaped obscurity. For every captive who managed to survive through skill, Thousands more were consumed without record, their bones left scattered across the steppes, their names erased from memory. The camp was a world built on fear, and fear kept the machine running. Captives woke each day knowing they might not live to see the next. Their survival depended not on their will, but on the shifting needs of an empire that saw them as little more than fuel. What we know of this life does not come from the voices of the enslaved, for most left no record. It comes from those who witnessed, who wrote of the smoke-filled camps and the silent rows of laborers bent beneath their loads. Our knowledge of these horrors survives only through the chilling words of those who watched and remembered. What we know of the fate of captives under Mongol rule is filtered through the words of those who saw, survived, or heard enough to pass it on. Persian historians, Chinese chroniclers, and European travelers all left accounts that, when read together, paint a picture more dreadful than any one voice could capture. Their words echo, with the weight of cities emptied, women enslaved, and children erased from the record. They are not neutral reports. They are attempts to describe something that defied belief, even in an age accustomed to violence. One of the most vivid sources is Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian who wrote in the service of the Mongol court itself. His chronicles, meant to preserve the story of the empire, also reveal the scale of its cruelty. He records cities where tens of thousands were slaughtered in a single sweep, and others where the people were stripped of their homes and marched away as captives. Even within his careful words, meant to flatter Mongol power, the outlines of horror are impossible to miss. Other Persian chroniclers, less concerned with pleasing the empire, describe the aftermath of conquest in tones of despair. They write of mothers ripped from children, of men driven as slaves to drag the tools of their own destruction, of girls sold into markets far from the lands of their birth. Their testimonies add the human detail that official accounts sought to bury. Where Rashid al-Din might speak of populations relocated, others speak of families shattered and blood flowing in the streets. Chinese records echo the same themes. Local officials recorded the devastation as the Mongol armies advanced into their towns and villages. They wrote of captives pressed into endless labor, of women distributed among soldiers, of children who vanished into the machinery of conquest. For many Chinese chroniclers, the terror was not only in the immediate violence, but in the certainty that resistance was useless. Entire communities surrendered in hopes of mercy, only to find themselves herded into chains or cut down all the same. From Europe came the voices of travelers who never faced Mongol steel directly, but who heard the stories carried by survivors. Merchants and envoys returned from the east with tales that sounded more like nightmares than news. They spoke of rivers clogged with bodies, of entire cities left in silence, of captives marched until they collapsed and were left to rot by the roadside. The fear traveled faster than the armies themselves, spreading across kingdoms and courts like a second invasion. By the time the Mongols reached the edge of Europe, their reputation alone had broken resistance in places untouched by their arrows. It was this reputation, built as much on rumor as on record, that turned the name of the Mongols into a byword for terror. To hear that they were coming was often enough to spark panic, to drive towns to surrender before the riders appeared on the horizon. And yet, surrender was no shield. The stories made clear that survival under Mongol rule was a gamble, and that captivity was rarely the mercy it seemed in the moment. Through these sources, scattered across languages and centuries, we glimpse what it meant to be taken alive. It was not freedom spared, but freedom stolen, a life lived under the shadow of another's power. The survivors were not the fortunate. They were the ones condemned to endure a different kind of death, stretched out across days, months, or years. Under the Mongols, survival was rarely mercy. It was another form of slow destruction. The city still burns in memory, its streets lit not by lanterns but by flames. The shouts of warriors echo alongside the cries of those bound in ropes, driven from their homes with nothing but fear in their hands. For the captives, survival was not the end of terror. It was the start of something far worse. The men who thought they had escaped the sword were broken under endless labor. The women who believed they had been spared found their bodies claimed as prizes. The children who should have been too young to matter were taken or slain, their futures erased before they could begin. Even the old, who had seen a lifetime of seasons, were cut down or abandoned, as if their years carried no weight at all. For millions across Asia and Europe, capture at Mongol hands was not a rescue from death, but a sentence to a different kind of ending, one drawn out and merciless. The empire built its strength not only on the land it seized, but on the people it consumed. In chains and in silence, captives became the true foundations of conquest. The Mongols did not just conquer territories, they conquered body, soul, and memory.